All right, and the first thing I'd like to say, I think Uni, I saw her earlier, Uni Smith. So Uni is actually kind of responsible for, I didn't know of Uni until now. I know that she is quite the really what I would call the matriarch of freedom in the state of Alabama in many ways. And in many ways, she was responsible for getting and cobbling a lot of these doctors together to meet, because a lot of us, as you probably have already realized, some of us were questioning the system a while back. And so what that usually means is a lot of us are pretty independent. And that independence obviously means that we're not always in communication with each other. But when this came in 2020, I think she recognized that and a lot of these doctors needed to get together and actually kind of advocate for what was right, as opposed to what the system and your government was telling you. And I think I'm just thankful for Uni. I mean, a lot of things that happened in my life in the last 4 to 5 years have been nothing of my own doing. In fact, I would tell you I was just at the right place at the right time in a lot of ways. But and some are already pointed it out. I mean, the two things in medicine that I think are important is, one, I look at it as empathy for the patient, meaning caring about the patient in front of you. I think that has been lost in medicine. And then also curious about why they're there, because they've got better things to do, okay? If they're really coming to you for your advice, first of all, care about them. But second of all, be like, why are you coming to me? What can I do to help you? Instead of telling them that they're crazy for being there. So I don't know where medicine got off on that curiosity was not part, first of all, care and curiosity. I will say one thing that a couple quick little stories was, one, the men that are now in charge are men that even RFK Jr., who's a friend of mine now, would tell you the problems in medicine are probably at their base spiritual, okay? And what that means is that a lab rat is a lab rat. A human is somebody that's both a physical being but also a spiritual being, okay? And from that standpoint, if you only treat them physical, you're going to be a terrible doctor, okay? And what that has to be done, the change that has to be made is, for the most part, they have driven the spiritual aspect of the human out of medicine. And what you have to demand is that needs to be back, okay? And that's important. I think RFK said it best. I think he is a spiritual man because of his picadillos when he was younger with drugs. But in a lot of ways, it brings you to your knees as well. And I think that's where he found that. The other thing is, about 18 months ago, somebody, I think it was my nurses, was like, there's this guy that's trying to get in touch with you. And I was like, who, whatever, probably some, board of medicine going to throw me in the jail again or whatever. But no, but it happened to be somebody named Dr. Redfield. And I was like, Dr. Redfield? I was like, okay, yeah. So Dr. Redfield obviously used to be head of the CDC. He's kind of a big burly man with a beard, and really somebody that I've grown to really like. But he called me and said, you're one of the hardest people to get in touch with. And by the way, I should be the hard person to get in touch with because I'm the head of the CDC. And I was like, okay. Well, anyway. But a couple of things that he said to me were, he's a Catholic man, but he told me a story. And one of the most important things he ever did was actually, he met with Pope John Paul, and Pope John Paul convinced him there was a God, which is kind of interesting for a man that was Catholic. I'm not Catholic, but and he also said, so in that case, what you have to understand, Jordan, is when you're taking care of somebody, you're taking care of one of God's children. And I was like, whoa, this is not who I would have expected to ever talk to me. And then second of all, he said, and then when he was back at some AIDS conference in the 80s, again, he was very, important in actually healing and figuring out HIV, not Fauci, even though Fauci claims he is. Dr. Redfield was actually at Walter Reed doing a lot of the kind of hardcore studies that allowed us to understand what was going on at the lymphatic system and what it was happening in the immune system. And he said, the other time I met some encyclical or something, again, I'm not Catholic, but he said, Pope John Paul also convinced me there is a purpose in suffering. And as being a physician, what you're doing is taking care of people that are suffering, and that is an important aspect of taking care of God's children. Never really heard it said like that, and again, most government officials, I'd throw most of what they say under the bus, but it was kind of impactful. And when I actually look now at the current people that are in charge, they're also, weird enough, all my friends, but Jay Bhattacharya, head of the NIH, is a PCA, part of a PCA church in San Francisco. Marty McCary is a Coptic Christian. Dave Weldon is a Christian. So again, we're talking about men that thankfully are bringing the fact that humans are different than lab rats back into how we take care of patients. And that is where we need to be back at. Does that make sense? So the other thing that was interesting when I was talking to Dr. Redfield as we became friends, and so that's why I think talking about COVID in general is important, because he says, well, Jordan, you know what they were doing in the Wuhan lab? And I was like, I mean, I've read about it, but I mean, I imagine you know a little bit more than I do. He said, well, I think this is declassified. And I was like, I'm sure it's probably not, but you can go ahead and tell me. But he goes, they were developing a dual purpose program, and what they were utilizing was this spike protein from a coronavirus to effectively develop an aerosolized vaccine that would allow them to aerosolize first the caves in northern China to actually immunologically stimulate bats. But they were also developing it in a way that they could aerosolize vaccines to the population in cities in China. And why this is important is two things. One, as much as the vaccine is bad, all of us actually got a messed up vaccine in the way that the COVID actually spread. Does that make sense? And they designed it in a way that they wanted the spike protein to be glycosylated in a way that did not allow it to activate the innate immune system. And so from that standpoint, what they were trying to do is basically get rid of the alarm system that your body had so they could reuse it multiple times to deploy whatever they wanted to vaccinate the populations very easily. So most of this is now in the public domain because it was released since. This is about 2 years ago. When he told me that, I was like, holy. Anyway, not a very good word that I said, but yeah. But it also goes to the fact that I think there's even within the health freedom movement that people are saying, well, if you didn't get vaccinated, you're not in trouble. And the reality is we all got vaccinated by something we didn't ask for. Okay, even the ones that were able to stand up and not get a shot. This thing is not something that was naturally evolved, if that makes sense. So. And it did. So the weird thing I said, well, that makes sense, Dr. Redfield. Again, I don't have any proof of this, but I was like, when you look back at all the pictures, weren't they like spraying all the cities? And everybody thought that was bleach. I was like, could have that been that they were spraying the thing that we were talking about? And he goes, I never really thought about it. I was like, I hope you have thought about that. But anyway, all that to say, that's why COVID really does have a long tail. And it's a long tail that definitely cumulatively from the spike protein state is not good. But just because you're not vaccinated, again, I'm not here to drive fear in anybody. Probably the biggest fear is take the hubris of man and get them the heck out of the lab messing with the genetics of viruses, by the way. That's what you should be fearful of, and you should fight every day to make sure people aren't messing with this stuff. But that's what our government was doing. And basically the other thing is when he says dual purpose, what you also got to realize is when somebody from the government, especially in the CDC, is saying dual purpose, what they're saying is there was a good purpose and there was a purpose that was nefarious with it. And so as much as whether that's a bioweapon or not, I mean, again, I don't want to get into, but at that point, that's, again, we need to, and that's really why Dr. Redfield and Fauci really hated each other since they worked in Gallo's lab in the 70s. But Gallo, if you ever read about Robert Gallo, I mean, he has quite an interesting history. I mean, he claimed he discovered AIDS, but he actually stole the sample from Didier Raoult in France. And anyway, so actually had to probably have his Nobel Prize taken back from him. But Redfield came out of that, and him and Fauci were not partners, but they came at the same time. And Fauci believed that science would always win, and science was the only thing that mattered. And the reality is, in the world we live in, the thing that matters is God's children, not science. Science can be used in good ways, but Oppenheimer found out a long time ago that science doesn't always have good endings. In fact, sometimes the science that we mess around with ends up having devastating consequences, and those devastating consequences a lot of times outlive the people that discovered them. So anyway, I'm not trying to be fearful, but anyway, it was interesting to see that in 2012, 2013, he was the one that was the biggest advocate to say, we should never publish the things that you're discovering, or he calls him Tony. It's like, Tony, you're crazy. Why the hell are we publishing this? And then why the heck are we even doing it, much less funding it? And this was around the time that CRISPR came along, and they actually had the bird flu in I think it was Germany or Holland, and they published it. Like, it was just like a textbook for how to do these kind of things. And then obviously it was outlawed in 2014, and of course our government in all its wisdom decided to fund the continued research in China, because China is a great, trustworthy partner. So, and even if the USAID stuff that just came out recently, the guy who was actually patient zero, HU, for actually having the virus, I think he received about $50 million from USAID for researching this. So as much as we think it's all the NIH, actually, actually most of the money came from the DoD and USAID. It did not come, about $3 to $7 million came from the NIH, but most of it came from something that has nothing to do with science, supposedly. So anyway, regardless, what I like to talk about this is the COVID and the long tail. And so this is kind of an old kind of diagram that I like to talk about, is kind of the metaphor that I usually say is, again, using SARS-CoV-2 as both the spike protein that you would get from the vaccine, but also from this, in many ways, human-devised vaccine that was supposed to be aerosolized that got out of the lab in China. I kind of look at it as my father playing with my boys. My boys now are actually 7 and 9, so this is, and the boys representing my immune system, and then in a sense, my house. So again, my house being my body, organ system, etc. Okay, and so what really happens is my father plays with the boys. So there's lots of spike protein replication, SARS-CoV-2 replication. My now 7 and 9-year-old boys act like themselves, so there's immune system overactivation, and in many ways, my house is a mess. So organ system dysfunction at entry level, or every level inside and out. Okay, and so that's kind of how I look at it. And then to fix it, in many ways, what my goal was, and still what we're learning about, is somebody's got to send my father home, okay? Because otherwise, and then somebody's got to get the boys to bed. So somebody's got to clear COVID or clear the spike protein. Somebody's got to actually downregulate the immune system. So somebody has to put my boys to bed. Not that they ever actually go to bed like this, but. And then somebody has to clean up the mess. And so clearance of microvascular sludge, inflammatory cytokines, autoantibodies, etc. And so in a lot of ways, what was interesting and what kind of brought me to this is it was pretty early in 2020 that it was pretty obvious that people that were actually surviving hospitalization were people that were on anticoagulants or antiplatelets. And so it was funny, even now, the people that I see that are like, I was in the hospital for 4 months and I survived. And I'm like, did you get AFib? Did you have a clot? Or did you get on ECMO? And like literally 100% every one of them did. And it's like, thank God you had a clot, because you got an anticoagulant that actually allowed you to live. The people that didn't get that aren't with us anymore. And in the same way, the people that were likely to leave the hospital, you were twice as likely to leave the hospital in the spring of 2020 if you're on an anticoagulant. And most of the people that you knew in 2019 that were on anticoagulants probably weren't healthier than the people that weren't. And so that was one of the kind of the signs that said, hey, this is an interesting finding. And so this is again from Harvard Medical School around I think 2020 or 2021. And basically describing COVID-19 as a vascular disease. And when we think of the vascular system, we're talking really about the tubes. But in a sense, the tubes are just like kind of how we think about it. Instead, actually, it's multiple cells, the inside of cells, the endothelium, the outside of cells, the musculature of the cells. And so not only are they actually responsible for moving things, but they're also responsible for lots of immunological function. So a lot of what we have done, and I'm going to kind of jump through this, but a lot of what we've done is looking at the spike protein and how it uniquely can catalyze fibrinolytic formation. So typically in the blood, you need some activation of thrombin to actually produce a clot. And in this thing, the spike protein itself would do that. So these people de novo were starting to get clotting dysfunction. And clotting dysfunction has issues. They're a signal, so they're a signal because, again, I always talk about thromboinflammation. The clotting system is not ever separated from the inflammatory system. And in fact, they're so intertwined that they might as well be the same system. So if clotting dysfunction is present, then you're going to have inflammatory dysfunction. And then, so the interesting thing is Risha, who Summer was talking about a little while ago, was already starting to see this prior to COVID in people with chronic disease states. And so chronic disease states meaning things like type 2 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, things that we currently say, hey, you're old, you have dementia. And dementia is one of those terms that's like, okay, yeah, you can't think, but what is the root cause? And so it was interesting that the other person that we work with is Jaco Labscher. Jaco was a cardiac intensivist at the time, and he started to look under the microscope of these people and see what their blood looked like. And the interesting thing is the blood started to look like somebody who had chronic disease on a crazy level. And these people usually not only had severe acute COVID, but the interesting thing is they found them after the fact still actually having this in their blood in the people with what we would call post-acute COVID or long COVID. So in many ways, I kind of like to look at it from this. Think of this as a small vessel. This is somebody with healthy platelet-poor plasma. Where the arrow is what fibrin would usually form, but usually the body's able to get rid of it. In COVID-19, you get a lot of like kind of long, stringy issues. And that fibrin forms in an abnormal way. It's harder to break down, it sludges up the vessels, it eliminates the ability to get oxygen to tissues, and it eliminates it in mainly its dense delivery mechanism. So all this, you don't realize that obviously red blood cells are what make us be able to get up and get around. They're our dense delivery mechanism, but all of us have dissolved oxygen in our blood that actually can sustain us. So when you think about how a cell sitting on a petri dish is actually able to get oxygen, it's actually through diffusion. But the interesting thing is diffusion's fine for like laying in bed in a sense, but if you actually want to get up and do stuff, if you don't actually get dense delivery of oxygen through red blood cells to the tissues, then you're going to be in trouble. So in a sense, what happens is it's a microvascular dysfunction that doesn't really leave the trace of a classic thing like a stroke or something that you would normally see or Philip would see on a CT or MRI. Instead, it's just intermittent ischemia, and it's ischemia that's especially demand related. And then also just the spike protein itself can clog up these vessels. So the other thing it does is it activates platelets in an inappropriate way. And so on the I guess that's the left for y'all, is just normal platelets that have been immunostained, and then when you activate them and expose them to spike protein, they turn into these big globular messes, which are also not friendly. So when we talk about long COVID, and the reason I want to bring this up, I actually was talking to my wife about what I wanted to talk about, was a lot of the people that we saw initially were people that it was very easy to believe that something had changed very dramatically. Some of them were Division I athletes that were running a 4-minute mile 3 months ago and now couldn't run at all, and they weren't depressed. Or they were people that were running a race and all of a sudden their legs didn't work, and these people obviously could run quite a better mile than I could. And so in a lot of ways, in those first kind of elite athlete 19 to 21-year-olds, it was pretty easy because even the trainers would be like, you know, the harder we work them, the worse they get, you know, which is not typical for anything that they would normally have done. And so it was easy to kind of think through that there was actually all these issues going on. But when you started kind of backing up and looking at somebody who's in their 50s and 60s and 70s, it's a lot easier for a family member or their doctor or just anybody to rationalize, hey, I might just be getting older, I might just be getting, you know, not as sharp as I used to be, you know, I do get short of breath going up the stairs, but you know what, I hadn't been working out this week, so, you know, like, you start to come up with a lot of reasons that things aren't working correctly. And the reality is what we've found in a lot of these people, especially if it dovetails in some way to whether they've been vaccinated within, you know, 4 to 6 months to having COVID in 4 to 6 months, there's a high likelihood that the vascular damage as the culprit is present. And so in that case, it's led us down the road of actually helping a lot of people. In fact, I think the oldest people we've helped are in their 90s, which is kind of crazy, keeping them out of assisted living places and getting, not that we wanted to get them back driving, but they did. And it was from the understanding that there's a disease process, you might have heard of it, it's the last 5 years. I mean, again, most of them go to their doctors and they say, look, there's nothing there, nothing we can do about it, and you're just getting old. And the reality is most of the doctors haven't read and looked at what COVID can do to the vasculature and the immune system and how that affects everyone. I thank the Lord, a lot of people did not get vaccinated, but even within my people that have severe COVID, you don't have to be vaccinated to have it. Meaning, again, when we talk about, there are some precursors to issues. We can go through genetic propensities, clotting propensities, a lot of things that make you more likely to have it, but it doesn't necessarily, if you, again, I don't want to be like somebody here like just saying, if you didn't get vaccinated, you're, good, but which is good, but I don't want to be like, well, you're fine. So, because a lot of people come and say, I don't feel right. I definitely know after I got COVID, I didn't get better. A lot of these people don't necessarily have viral symptoms day 1 or day 7. Most of the people that I see are a combination of people that were so sick they got in the hospital, and thank God they got on blood thinners and got out, and we've got to repair the damage that doctors did to them by putting them on ventilators. Doctors screw you up too. Because again, the worst thing you can do to a vascular issue of the lung is actually put somebody on a ventilator. You actually make it even more likely that there's less vascular return to the lung. But most of the other people that didn't have that, they'll say, I didn't really even know I had COVID. A lot of my athletes will say, I tested positive because I had to take a test before a race or something. And then 2 to 8 weeks later is when they started to have symptoms, and the symptoms were pretty amazing in terms of their multi-systems involvement and the effect on their life. So again, kind of this very broad effects, and that's why medicine isn't really set up to deal with it. Because again, if you have chest pain, you go to a cardiologist. If you have breathlessness, you go to a pulmonologist. If you've got tachycardia, brain fog, what I'm saying is, you'll go to 5 specialists, and all 5 specialists can't think of that there might be a root cause for all of it. Does that make sense? And so, and again, this is just kind of I would say, a very limited list of the things. I feel like every day I'm confronted with new things, and the vaccine is even weirder. So it can, just because of its ability to penetrate into the CNS, it can cause some crazy stuff from a neurological level. But the interesting thing was, all of these causes at their source were in many ways vascular. And I don't really want to go into T-cell abnormalities and stuff, that'd be boring, but just thinking about how it affects the vasculature. So a lot of things, when we talk about red blood cells that can't get to tissues, what that a lot of times does is create ischemia, a fancy word for not getting oxygen, but ultimately hypoxia. The muscle actually, in many ways, just think of the skeletal muscle, it operates in a way that is going to say, hey, I may never get oxygen again. Usually when you go work out and you kind of cause some ischemia to the muscle is going to be like, hey, we're going to grow back in a positive way, we're going to double size, we're going to kind of increase our energy availability. Instead, when this happens, the muscle actually says, we might not never get oxygen again. We might need to alert everybody that we're in trouble, send out inflammatory signals, and make you feel like crap for the next 2 to 3 days. And so in many ways, that's what we would call kind of post-exertional malaise. And I think that's an important concept that a lot of people don't understand. It's not laziness. The guy that ran a 4-minute mile, trust me, I'm lazier than that dude. Anyway. So, but again, it takes actually discovering these things sometimes in people that there's no other explanation. It's not easy to rationalize. But ultimately, it causes damage to other tissues undergoing hypoxia. And ultimately, actually, when you reintroduce oxygen, we call it ischemic reperfusion injury, but you actually cause even more harm. So this is kind of just, again, I don't want to give you all a crazy lecture, but so the vessel damage ultimately leading to local tissue hypoxia. And the areas of the body that actually are the most dependent on dense delivery of oxygen happen to be the areas that are most affected. So brain, vestibular system, the eyes, the skeletal muscle, myocardium, so the heart muscle, the eye, the skin. Okay, so a lot of these people have lots of cognitive issues, lots of weird heart issues that they go to see Richard Vest, and Richard Vest is like, I don't know, but it's not AFib, but they definitely feel different. They have lots of weird eye issues in many ways, and also lots of balance issues as well. They also just feel like crap, to be honest. I mean, if somebody continually feels like junk and continues to get sick, I mean, again, I see it through a biased lens, but I'm almost like, probably. And then the other thing that's interesting is what we've discovered a lot is, and this kind of goes actually back to Summers' kind of stuff as well, is mast cells are a huge part of this. So when I classically think about mast cells, we think about a bee stinging the skin, or bee stinging you and then you getting a whelp. And that's classically what we think about mast cells. They release histamine. But mast cells are actually this very pluripotent immune cell that's all over our tissue interfaces with the environment. So that's a fancy way of saying like eyes, nasopharynx, oropharynx, GI tract, skin, lungs, and then they're all around the vessels, which is why we started seeing and understanding them a lot more. And then they're hugely involved in how your brain operates, so from short-term memory to executive function, those kind of things. And so a lot of these people come and say, you know, I used to never be allergic to any of these things, but now I can't eat this, I touch this, you know, I can't be around my house. Every time I get an infection, the whole world goes crazy. And they go to an allergist, of course they go to the regular doctor, and no one's really put it together that, again, imagine that these cells that are supposed to degranulate almost like your alarm system, imagine the alarm system has been turned up to 15, and like every little thing, like, you know, just even the minute emotional stress, these things degranulate and cause vascular inflammation as well as inflammation in all the other places that it does. And so when we get back to the gut microbiome, as well as like what you eat, a lot of these things actually interface with why they're having a lot of systemic symptoms, okay? And so it's very interesting to me that a lot of these people are, you know, it's weird, they'll be like, oh, well, now they have asthma. And I'm like, you're 70, you don't get asthma at 70. Like, I mean, instead, I mean, I will say I'm rethinking what actually asthma is, but that's a whole different discussion. But it's definitely this kind of abnormal immune response that is resulting in crazy dysfunction. And so a lot of things that we were talking about, like avoiding triggers, dietary changes, reducing stress, minimizing exposure to allergens, avoiding COVID injections. Was a good claim. Most of these people are always like, you know, when I got that COVID injection, my arm, you know, went up, or I got rashes, or all these kind of things. Again, you're kind of stimulating the immune system in an improper way. And the other thing I will say when we talk about vaccines, the interesting thing that I've kind of gone down the pathway with is, you know, as much as me and Dr. McCullough and a lot of other people like this, we're just seeing the fraud and the way that this vaccine came to market being so dysfunctional. It was actually Del Bigtree. We were actually having a conversation, I think, in Nashville. And he goes, Jordan, I challenge you. First of all, how much time did you spend in med school studying like vaccine trials and their side effects and those kind of things? And I was like, I actually would say zero, because the only time we ever talked about vaccines was when to give them, which is an interesting, and ask any med student that and they will tell you that. But also, and then he says, what if I told you this is how the sausage is always made? And I took that challenge, and I'd like most of y'all to probably take that challenge, because it is a lot more, even why the Hep B is on the baby schedule has to do with Merck saying, hey, you told us to make this vaccine, no one's taking it. And so the vaccine advisory committee said, oh, we'll just make it for babies when they're born. I mean, it has nothing to do with your health, if that makes sense. And so again, I mean, I think RFK Jr. is going to expose this in many ways, and again, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think immunological stimulation, and that's what I think of vaccines in some ways, may have usefulness, and I think it does. But I challenge a lot of people to say, if we treated cancer like we did in the 90s, like continued, meaning cut, kill, and burn, we don't do that anymore. In fact, what's the most useful therapies for cancer? Immunological treatments. Oh, that's interesting. So maybe your immunological system, how your body works, actually is involved in whether cells multiply, divide, all those things in the proper way. And so now if the therapies that they're giving you for cancer are impacting the immune system, maybe we don't need to screw with the immune system as much as they've told us. Just food for thought. But that's a very general way to think about it, if that makes sense. So and even when I was in front of the Judiciary Committee up in Congress, even the shill for the Infectious Disease Society next to me would agree that there's people you don't give vaccines to. And the reason you don't give vaccines to these people is because, again, simple metaphor, but it's a bear in a cage. The bear's already awake. You don't want to poke it. And in many ways, so immunological stimulation has effects. Those effects are multiple. And in fact, if you read the inserts of any of the vaccines that are available, the inserts that actually have some information on them, unlike the COVID EUA vaccine that was a blank insert, you will find that from Guillain-Barré to MS to all of these neurologically implicated disease processes are part of those vaccines. They're unavoidable. It's just part of the process. And so in many ways, if you look at everybody as a lab rat and are utilitarian, it makes somewhat of sense to say, hey, we're going to vaccinate or, hey, aerosolize a vaccine to a population in China. But most of us live in America where we think there is, there's this give and take and there's rights to us in ability to decide what goes in our body. And one of the more interesting things that Scott Gottlieb said recently, who was the former FDA guy and happens to be on the board of Pfizer, big surprise. He said he was worried about RFK Jr. Starting to actually have vaccines be dual consent. And dual consent basically means that it's a decision between the patient or the patient's parent and their physician. Most people thought that that's what was already happening, didn't you? No, they're scared that it's going to go back to that. Does that make sense? So what you need to realize is, when did it ever change? So that has to be, again, I think it's almost embarrassing that that's what he's scared of. He's scared of actually dual consent. The physician thinks it's a good idea. The patient or the patient's parent thinks it's a good idea. That's the madness we live in. So I don't know how I got off on that. But anyway, so the interesting thing, a lot of these things that are mast cell active, there's lots of things that are natural, that are mast cell stabilizers, quercetin, luteolin, pycnogenol, curcumin. There's a lot of things in kind of the more and more that we look at that from a natural standpoint. A lot of these natural things, if they weren't natural already and Pfizer could get their hands on them before you knew about them, they probably would be pharmaceuticals, and just to be honest. So the other thing that is actually interesting, and this kind of goes back to just kind of my own weirdness, that we've gone from a vascular understanding to what COVID's doing and understanding of oxygen delivery. But the other thing that we've discovered, me and this cardiologist at Emory named Alexis Cutchins, who's kind of my partner in crime in a lot of this, is what it also damages is the venous system. And so the venous system is, most people don't care about it. So when we think about the cardiovascular system, the heart and the arterial system, 17% of your blood volume, it's a high pressure system. It's what your cardiologist cares about. Your venous system holds about 70% of your blood volume, and it is not good blood. It is post-tissue blood, it's low oxygen, it's inflammatory, it's coagulable, and it is a passive system, okay? So in a sense, it is also a capacitance system. So God designed us, if we're upright like I am right now, that our venous system would kind of close up a little to keep blood going back to the right side of my heart, okay? So I don't fall out and feel like I'm short of breath. But when you damage the endothelium of the venous system, what it does is basically take away that capacitance, so the tonality of the vessel is compromised. So all of a sudden, this reservoir that is typically able to fluctuate between 2 to 5 to 7 liters is unable to do that. And so a lot of young, healthy, slender, active people come in and they're like, I can't walk up the stairs anymore. I feel exhausted every morning I wake up. My legs feel heavy. They also start to develop all kinds of other symptoms like urinary urgency, sacral back pain, menstrual dysfunction, GI dysfunction, especially hemorrhoids to lower GI stuff. And it is actually weird enough, most of these people in the young population of me are all vaccinated, even though they also got COVID. But they're usually hypermobile. That actually has someone was talking about that. They're usually super active, and they're historically people that usually were the friend you had that had to get up every morning and run 3 miles even on vacation, that person. Does that make sense? And the reason they did that is, guess what? What's the best way to move venous blood in the first place? this movement. So again, they got a positive feedback for that. And so what we found is these people have what we call cardiovenous syndrome. And so less blood into the right side of the heart. Again, if the heart is a pump and you're actually trying to have more cardiac output and you're not supplying good cardiac input, the heart is going to beat faster. You're not going to get as much blood to the lungs. The lungs do more than just actually oxygenate. They also get rid of carbon dioxide. And so the other thing that happens is you get what we call hypocapnic cerebrohypoperfusion. And so that's a fancy term for saying if CO2 sticks around too long, the pH of your blood changes, which causes the vessels in your brain to actually shrink, and you feel like you can't think anymore and you got to go take a nap. And so again, a lot of these things we're finding. And so in about 500 people, what we found when we look at their pelvic venous vasculature from 12-year-olds to, I think the oldest person we've done is 82, is that they have complete occlusion of their left iliac vein. And the weird thing was, and this just goes back to how being curious leads to this, is the person that actually intervened for me about 2 years ago, she's kind of the world expert in pelvic venous disease. And I was explaining to her what was going on, and she was like, Jordan, these people are born with it. I don't know, you don't know what you're talking about. And I was like, okay, well, at least I know you're gonna fix them right, so I don't really care what you think. But about a year later, after seeing a couple hundred of these people, she goes, Jordan, I think you're right, something's happening. And the reality was, it was, again, the vascular damage. So these people that already had kind of a propensity to have compression, that compression all of a sudden becomes critically significant, and they go from somebody who ran 5 miles a day, or some of these older women or women that like to walk like 7 miles a day, to where they can't do it at all. And the other interesting fact is Brooke, who's my kind of interventionalist, she's probably done 8,000 procedures of this before, and before COVID, she had done 5 men. And again, most of the time that this happens is after pregnancy, or the child sits on the vasculature of the pelvis, causes endothelial damage, or somebody who has like endometriosis, adenomyosis, or just, and then obviously women have, well, depends on who you ask, but women have uteruses, and they also are childbearing. They also have hormones, and especially progesterone and estrogen are very vasoactive. They also stimulate mast cells. And so men never got this. Out of the 350 people she's fixed for me, 120, almost 150 of them have been men. So there's your sign. Something's changed. So yeah, and they're not white men for Harris. They're men. They are men. Yeah, or whatever that. What was that?
You got it.
Yeah. So this is kind of a good example. This is a little 39-year-old girl of mine. But my plumber, when she puts a catheter down right here, usually you're going to have venous blood flow go back to the heart really easily. And instead, the blood actually goes on this very circuitous pathway. And that's a very delayed way to get blood back to the heart. And so in about, again, 350 of these people, you can't really see it, but there's actually kind of a chicken wire thing here. Once you open it up, this goes away. Not only do they get back to running, one of my girls is actually, she's a track coach at Stanford, but she was a Division I runner at TCU, and once she got this done, she was back running in college, which is kind of nuts too. So a lot of them, the reason I'm kind of showing you this is because it's interesting how many people just ignore this, but a lot of them feel really good when they're flat. So when you lie down, and they always want to lie down, they don't like to sit up, they don't like to stand. It's because the central blood volume, the available blood to pump actually at the heart, 30% is in your thorax while you're supine. All of us, when we stand up, about 1 liter of blood goes into our butt and our legs, but we typically have a little bit of an increase in heart rate. Our vessels constrict because they're healthy, and we get blood back to our heart. And when these people, they have this central blood volume that's much lower because there's this additional pelvic venous reservoir that's kind of staying that way while they're upright. Okay, so anyway, so what I guess the point of that is the diversity of the issues. So you got somebody who's overweight, was in the hospital, now short of breath, life's awful, which is what they always talk about. Oh, they had pre-existing conditions. Almost all of these people that I've seen with this, I mean, they are every person that you think of that ate right, exercised, and are the perfect vision of health. Like they're the person you would be envious of that is now stuck in bed. And that just shows you again, and guess what, when they go to the doctor's office, guess how they're treated? Like, what are you doing here? You look better than me. But they know the difference and they know what's going on. And it's been very satisfying to say, you're not crazy. You don't have to go to psychological therapy to learn how to fill out a calendar. Instead, it's actually, what's actually happening is physiological. And so I think that's the most important part again, is we have had something affect us in the last 5 years. First of all, medicine has a blind spot to it. They don't want to admit what happened. I think there's a secondary reason that they don't, and the reason they don't is because to admit what happened would admit that the vaccine also was devastating. Okay, so that's why there's very little looking into this, because to understand the pathophysiology of the destruction that long COVID does is to also say, that is the craziest, stupidest thing we ever did in modern medicine. And we did it. The other thing is that I'm not sure many of them, I hope they would get in the books and read them, but a lot of the research is very blinded to this because of that same reason. So most of the stuff that, the people that are actually having an open mind about it happen to be like South Africa and Europe, probably because there's not as much of a profit center around medicines and vaccines. And not to say that I want a socialist medicine, because I don't. I think it's awful. Not that we have a free market system. We don't. We actually have just a, what I call a corporatocracy. But that's one of the reasons I think they're being more open-minded, is because they're okay with not paying for the vaccine, because the vaccine's a line item in their national budget. If it ain't helping, they're getting rid of it. In fact, most European countries don't actually recommend these vaccines like we do, especially for children or anything like that. So if you look at the vaccine schedules of a lot of European countries, you'd be like, we got the wrong schedule because it's really short. But the reason it's really short is that they've got a more robust way of looking at whether it's useful or not. And if it ain't useful or it causes harm, they're going to get rid of it. And so that's what they've done. All right, so with that, I didn't want to bore y'all. I will say that a lot of things that we've been doing are just continuing to kind of understand what the vasculature is doing, and how COVID and especially the vaccine's affecting it. There's a paper that came out in December that was kind of, somebody had actually developed a way to look at where lipid nanoparticles were going with mRNA. And it was kind of funny because the whole point of the paper was they needed to understand the biodistribution of mRNA and lipid nanoparticles better. First of all, you should have said, well, did y'all not already do that? No, they hadn't. So when they did it, the interesting thing is that the SARS-CoV-2 mRNA lipid nanoparticles target the endothelium, and the endothelium of the heart especially. And so even the myocarditis are 100%. Of course, they documented that in the paper. They were like, this could explain a lot of the rare events that are happening. Of course, it was published in Nature. And of course, the first paragraph had to say how successful the vaccine campaign was, like every paper does. Otherwise, it doesn't get published. But I am hopeful for the next 4 years that we have people that are going to make a difference. The most important difference being that they understand that patients are physical and spiritual, and that we are, as doctors, should be humble to the fact that we don't know everything, and the person we're taking care of is more than a lab rat. So, and you should demand that. That's the other thing. I think people have gotten used to being thought of in a way that says it's okay to treat everybody. And when they say evidence-based, go ahead and just walk out. I'm just kidding. What they really mean is, I don't want to listen to you, and I'm going to listen to this paper over here, and paper's obviously sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. But it's their way to say, I really don't care. So with that, again, Philip's coming up next.